This chapter stayed buried because reopening it was politically inconvenient. After World War II, the Arctic was framed as resolved, distant, strategically settled. The United States built bases, Denmark retained sovereignty, Europe trusted the arrangement, and everyone quietly agreed not to press further. The Cold War did more than divide blocks. It froze assumptions. As long as ice remained thick and shipping lanes remained hypothetical, Greenland could sit safely in the margins of policy papers. Institutions thrive on margins. They create the comfort of permanence. But history does not vanish. It accumulates pressure. The 1946 negotiation was never about purchasing land. It was about securing future leverage. That future simply arrived later than expected. Europe mistook silence for stability. That misreading carries a cost. What changed was not intention, but environment. Melting ice converted geography into infrastructure. Undersea data cables, missile warning systems, satellite ground stations, extended runways capable of hosting strategic aircraft. These are tangible assets governed by treaties and defense agreements written for another era. NATO handles security. Denmark manages sovereignty. Greenland controls resources. The United States finances much of the backbone. That division functioned when nothing moved. Now everything does. Trump's signal exposed a structural weakness. When authority is fragmented, responsibility dissolves. Who decides when economic value explodes? Who pays when security costs surge? Who benefits when extraction becomes profitable? These are not abstract debates. They are contractual realities. Every contract produces winners and losers. Defense manufacturers, logistics operators, rare earth investors see accelerated opportunity. Their timelines are short. Their accountability limited. European taxpayers inherit the long-term exposure. Expanded Arctic militarization demands higher defense budgets, higher insurance costs on trade routes, sharper energy volatility. Who absorbs the impact? Not corporations. Ordinary workers do. Pension systems do. Small enterprises do. This is the transfer few politicians explain. Is this really about sovereignty or about capturing upside while dispersing risk? There's a complication Europe leans on. Greenland itself. An autonomous society increasingly conscious of its leverage, cautious of being repositioned as a strategic asset without consent. Any maneuver that sidelines local authority risks legal deadlock and political backlash. That resistance matters. But markets rarely wait for democratic sequencing. Capital anticipates outcomes, forcing institutions to respond after momentum has already shifted. That is the tension. Democratic legitimacy against financial acceleration, which yields first. Bring it closer. A port worker in Rotterdam faces reduced hours as insurers reprice Arctic risk. A household in northern Italy watches energy bills climb as routes recalibrate. Rent increases. Wages stall. Daily life adjusts faster than policy. How long can people be told this is distant strategy? Globally, the implications spread outward. Beijing recalculates. Moscow reassesses. The Arctic becomes a laboratory for a new power logic where signals matter more than signatures. And this is the moral fracture. Governance exists to buffer citizens from volatility, not normalize it. When leaders allow strategic ambiguity to erode economic security, the question becomes unavoidable. What are institutions protecting, and for whom? Stability is not nostalgia. It is a public obligation, and it must be defended consciously, not assumed by habit. This clash stayed obscured because both systems benefited from pretending they were compatible. Europe built its post-war identity on the idea that power could be domesticated, slowed down, disciplined by procedure. Treaties mattered. Process mattered. Even disagreement was supposed to follow rules. Markets were tools, not masters. Yet, parallel to that vision, another logic matured quietly, one that treated stability itself as a tradable asset. If institutions could not move fast enough, capital would. If sovereignty limited access, influence would reframe the question. This tension was never resolved because it did not have to be. Growth masked it. Globalization softened the edges. Everyone told themselves the same story, until conditions changed. The mechanism behind this rupture is brutally simple. Market power compresses time. Institutional power stretches it. Trump's move forced those timelines to collide. By framing Greenland as an asset tied to security costs and future returns, he shifted the conversation into a financial register. Once something is priced, it becomes negotiable. Once negotiable, it becomes volatile. Legal continuity cannot compete with momentum when investors, insurers, and defense planners recalibrate simultaneously. This is not rhetoric. Arctic shipping projections influence port investments. Rare earth valuations influence currency exposure. Defense postures influence bond yields. Each adjustment feeds the next. A loop forms. Can slow consensus survive a feedback loop designed for speed? Winners emerge quickly. Firms positioned in extraction, surveillance technology, logistics infrastructure gain leverage. They operate inside short cycles and can exit when conditions turn. Losers emerge quietly. States locked into long-term obligations, citizens tied to fixed incomes, workers whose skills match a stability that no longer exists. The conflict is not between nations, but between horizons. Short-term capture versus long-term cohesion. Europe's outrage reflects an unspoken fear that its model depends on time it no longer controls. There is resistance, and it is not symbolic. Law still matters. International agreements still bind. Domestic politics still constrain. Any attempt to convert strategic ambiguity into ownership faces judicial review, parliamentary backlash, and public scrutiny. These are not trivial barriers. They slow the machine, but slowing is not stopping. And every delay carries opportunity costs that markets eagerly exploit. Is obstruction a strategy, or just a pause before adaptation? Consider the human impact without abstraction. A technician employed by a European supplier loses a contract because a defense firm reorients procurement toward Arctic capabilities. A family postpones buying a home because interest rates inch upward amid geopolitical risk. The explanation offered is always the same. External factors. Necessary adjustments. Temporary uncertainty. Temporary for whom? On the global board. This fracture signals something larger. Power is migrating from rule makers to rule interpreters, from collective restraint to individual leverage. Others are watching closely, learning how far signals can travel without formal action. This is the moment citizens should ask the uncomfortable question: do leaders exist to manage volatility after it arrives, or to prevent it from becoming normal? Governance is not about elegance. It is about protection. And protection loses meaning when truth is posted. What made this moment destabilize was not aggression, but accounting. Trump framed the issue as an imbalance sheet rather than a territorial claim, and that distinction matters more than people realize. By asking who pays and who owns, he forced allies to confront arrangements they had stopped justifying aloud. Arctic security is not abstract. It is funded annually through appropriations, maintenance contracts, personnel rotations, satellite upgrades, fuel logistics. These flows of money exist whether the public notices or not. When someone asks why the costs are permanent but the control is not, the silence that follows becomes revealing. How long can a system rely on habit instead of rationale? The technical backbone behind this question is extensive and deliberately quiet. Greenland anchors early warning radar critical to missile detection. It hosts satellite relay points essential for navigation, communications, and intelligence across the Northern Hemisphere. As ice recedes, new maritime corridors shorten transit times between Asia, Europe, and North America, altering insurance models, port relevance, and naval doctrine. None of this requires ownership to function, but all of it requires leverage. Trump's reframing treated leverage as something that should be formalized, not assumed. Once leverage is named, it can be priced. Once priced, it enters negotiation. This shift creates clear beneficiaries. Defense contractors tasked with upgrading Arctic systems gain expanded mandates. Shipping firms positioned to exploit new routes attract speculative capital. Resource companies eye extraction licenses with renewed confidence. Their interest is immediate and measurable. The costs, however, unfold elsewhere. European states face pressure to co-finance infrastructure they do not fully control. Public budget strain. Long-term commitments expand while political accountability diffuses. Who signs the checks when the strategic logic changes midstream? There is an obstacle that complicates the equation. Ownership is not a switch that can be flipped. Sovereignty involves law, identity, consent. Greenland's population is small but politically aware, sensitive to external designs imposed without reciprocity. Any attempt to convert structural dependence into formal control risks resistance that markets cannot smooth over. Legal challenges stall projects. Social unrest raises risk premiums. Strategic clarity collides with democratic reality. That collision has consequences. Bring this back to daily life. A logistics worker in Antwerp sees freight volumes fluctuate as insurers reassess Arctic exposure. A telecommunications employee watches investment shift toward northern infrastructure, away from local networks. Training budgets tighten. Job mobility narrows. The explanation offered is efficiency, but the feeling is insecurity. How often are people asked to absorb strategic recalibration without a voice? Globally, this reframing signals a broader evolution. Power is no longer asserted only through force or treaties, but through questions that expose imbalance. Others take note. If costs can be weaponized rhetorically, alliances become conditional. The moral issue is not whether questions should be asked, but who bears the consequences when they are. Citizens deserve leaders who understand that making structures visible also makes people vulnerable. Governance should not merely reveal leverage. It should decide how that leverage is used and in whose interest. Markets reacted faster than diplomats because markets are trained to smell optionality. The mere reintroduction of the idea shifted probabilities. And in finance, probability is value. Capital does not wait for clarity. It positions itself ahead of it. Funds began modeling Arctic transit times, mineral output curves, insurance recalibration, infrastructure demand. None of this required a single treaty to be rewritten. All it required was a sense that what was previously unthinkable had become discussable. That is enough to move money. And once money moves, neutrality disappears. Is this still speculation, or has it already become direction? The legal architecture around Greenland suddenly moved from background noise to front-page relevance. Autonomy arrangements crafted to manage daily governance were never designed to withstand global capital interest. Greenland can authorize resource extraction, but cannot independently guarantee security or manage foreign investment at scale without Danish and NATO frameworks. That split is not a flaw. It was a compromise. But compromises become vulnerabilities when conditions change. Trump's signal threaded directly through that gap. By emphasizing economic partnership, infrastructure investment, and shared development rather than annexation, he avoided the legal tripwires that outright sovereignty claims would trigger. Formally compliant, substantively disruptive. The immediate winners are predictable. Mining firms secure early exploration rights. Logistics companies hedge port expansion. Financial institutions package Arctic exposure into tradable instruments. They gain upside without waiting for political resolution. The losers are slower, heavier, more exposed. European governments inherit the responsibility of stabilizing expectations they did not create. Citizens inherit the uncertainty. Long-term planning becomes reactive. Budgets chase market behavior instead of guiding it. Who is steering here? There is a counterforce, and it is not weak. Law still binds. Public opinion still constrains. Greenland's electorate has leverage precisely because markets cannot extract legitimacy. Resistance can slow permits, raise compliance costs, and trigger international scrutiny. But delay has a price. As hesitation grows, so does speculative pressure. Investors dislike vacuum. They push harder when clarity is absent. Institutions find themselves choosing between premature accommodation and prolonged instability. Neither is comfortable. Translate this into everyday consequences. A European manufacturer dependent on stable shipping schedules faces fluctuating freight costs as insurers adjust Arctic risk models. A municipal budget absorbs higher energy expenses as supply chains recalibrate. A household feels it in utility bills and groceries before any policy explanation arrives. These are not abstract ripple effects. They are immediate. Who explains to citizens that markets move first and governance followed? On the global stage, this episode signals a shift in how power is exercised. Influence no longer needs formal claims. It can be exerted by unlocking value in places institutions assumed were settled. Others are watching and learning. The moral challenge is clear. If markets can force political alignment simply by moving capital, then governance must evolve or concede ground. Citizens should demand leaders capable of anticipating these dynamics, not merely reacting to them. Stability is not maintained by freezing the past. It is maintained by understanding when the future starts accelerating. This is the point where theory stops protecting itself and reality intervenes. Markets do not shift gently. When capital reallocates in anticipation of new routes and resources, it pulls on every connected thread. Currency traders reassess exposure. Governments refinancing debt face new risk premiums. Investment funds rotate away from projects built on predictability toward those promising strategic upside. None of this requires a crisis headline. It happens quietly through models and mandates, but the consequences accumulate fast. European states already managing tight fiscal margins now confront expanded Arctic obligations, from surveillance and logistics to joint deployments. Defense budgets grow not because voters demanded them, but because uncertainty priced them in. And when one line item grows, another shrinks. There's no magic accounting. Someone always pays. Who do you think it is? Infrastructure projects get postponed because capital is redirected. Rail upgrades slow. Housing programs stall. Digital investment is resequenced. Social spending becomes conditional. These decisions are framed as prudence, but they are reactions, not strategies. For workers whose livelihoods depend on stable trade flows, the impact is immediate. Port activity fluctuates. Manufacturing contracts become shorter. Employers hedge by freezing wages or shifting to temporary labor. Energy prices swing harder as supply chains adjust to new risk assumptions. The explanation offered is global pressure. The feeling experienced is insecurity. How many times can stability be redefined downward before trust breaks? There are winners, of course. Financial actors agile enough to arbitrage volatility, extract value. Firms tied to defense, surveillance, and resource access gain political relevance and bargaining power. Their revenue curves rise precisely because uncertainty expands. The losers are diffuse and therefore quiet. Middle-income households absorb price shocks. Small businesses face tighter credit. Public services stretch thinner. This imbalance is not accidental. Volatility rewards speed and scale. Stability rewards patience and cohesion. Which one is being designed for? There is resistance to this trajectory, but it struggles against momentum. European policymakers attempt coordination, signaling restraint, emphasizing unity. Yet coordination moves at the speed of consensus, while markets move at the speed of expectation. Each delayed summit, each cautious statement, extends a gap, and into that gap flows speculation. Is restraint wisdom, or hesitation misread as weakness? Zoom out, and the pattern sharpens. What looks like a regional adjustment feeds into a global recalibration. Trade corridors shift. Energy alliances realign. Strategic geography regains primacy over efficiency. Nations less dependent on consensus gain leverage. Those anchored to procedural legitimacy feel exposed. The Arctic becomes a multiplier, not because of ice, but because of what it reveals about the system. The moral question is unavoidable. Governance exists to buffer citizens from shocks they cannot anticipate or control. When structural changes repeatedly land on household budgets before they appear in political debate, something has failed. People do not demand immunity from reality. They demand honesty, foresight, and protection proportionate to the risks imposed on them. Stability is not the absence of change. It is the promise that change will not be paid for blindly by those least equipped to absorb it. That promise is now being tested. Employment absorbs shock long before statistics admit it. When geopolitical risk rises, companies do not wait for confirmation. They model scenarios, tighten margins, and search for flexibility. Automation accelerates not because technology suddenly improved, but because uncertainty made human labor look expensive. Supply chains are rerouted not for efficiency, but for optionality. Hiring pauses quietly. Temporary contracts multiply. Stability is downgraded without announcement. This is how risk becomes personal before it becomes political. And once that process starts, reversing it is far harder than initiating it. The mechanics are precise. Banks reprice lending when exposure looks unstable. Firms facing higher borrowing costs respond by cutting variable expenses first. Labor is variable. Long-term contracts are renegotiated. Training budgets shrink. Career paths flatten. None of this violates labor law. It simply exploits its flexibility. Strategic uncertainty acts like a tax that is never voted on, paid through lost opportunity rather than explicit deduction. Who explains this to the worker whose job disappeared without a crisis headline? There are beneficiaries here as well. Multinationals with diversified footprints gain leverage over governments competing to retain employment. Technology providers profit as automation fills gaps left by cautious hiring. Financial actors hedge volatility while remaining insulated from its social cost. The losers are not a sector, but a generation navigating a labor market designed for impermanence. Europe's reaction is not only emotional, it is rational. A system built on institutional predictability cannot coexist comfortably with a territorial logic that treats stability as a purchasable service. What happens to social contracts when economic security becomes conditional? There is resistance, and it comes from unions, regulators, and parts of civil society insisting that labor cannot remain the shock absorber of strategic games. But their leverage weakens when capital can move faster than policy. Each delay, each fragmented response, reinforces the argument that flexibility is necessary. Necessary for whom? That question rarely receives a direct answer. Picture a mid-career engineer whose employer postpones expansion due to geopolitical exposure. Promotion stalls. Mortgage plans are shelved. A logistics worker accepts a short-term contract instead of a permanent one because the alternative is nothing. These are not abstract sacrifices. They shape lives, and they happen quietly, without debate, framed as prudence rather than consequence. On the global level, this trend reshapes power. Regions able to guarantee predictable employment gain influence. Those that rely on institutional continuity but hesitate to adapt lose ground. Transactional power spreads because it rewards speed, not consent. The philosophical break becomes concrete. Are workers participants in the system or buffers protecting it? This is the moral line. Governance is not meant to outsource risk downward while insulating those who design the exposure. Citizens deserve a voice before stability is converted into a negotiable commodity. Employment is more than income. It is dignity, planning, continuity. When leaders allow it to erode silently, they are not managing transition. They are normalizing precarity. And that is a choice societies have the right to question loudly. The danger lies in repetition, not in provocation. Once a precedent enters the system, it no longer belongs to the person who introduced it. It becomes available, reusable, adaptable. If strategic regions can be discussed as assets rather than commitments, then every quiet assumption becomes conditional. Governance shifts posture. It stops shielding and starts responding. Reactive systems always arrive late. Europe's post-war framework rested on belief that certain foundations were immovable, not because they were perfect, but because contesting them carried unacceptable cost. Borders were not efficient, but they were final. Security was not cheap, but it was shared. Sovereignty was slow, but it was respected. That architecture reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty is what markets fear most. Trump's Greenland signal pierced that architecture without breaking a single formal rule. That is what makes it unsettling. It demonstrated that credibility, not legality, is the real currency of stability. Once power shows it is willing to reopen settled questions, every other actor recalculates. Allies wonder which guarantees are firm and which are situational. Adversaries probe for similar seams. Investors adjust timelines. Institutions that relied on inherited legitimacy suddenly need to perform it. Can coherence be improvised under pressure? The mechanics of defense make this even sharper. Collective security depends on predictability. Force planning, procurement cycles, personnel readiness all assume stable commitments. When those assumptions wobble, redundancy increases. Redundancy costs money. Money is finite. States compensate by narrowing priorities. Some regions receive more attention, others less. This is how hierarchy returns to the back door, not declared but felt. And citizens notice when protection becomes uneven. There are winners in this recalibration. Actors able to project clarity gain leverage. States comfortable with ambiguity exploit hesitation. Corporations aligned with strategic assets secure long-term contracts. The losers are systems designed for permanence. European institutions now face a test they postponed. Can they generate credibility fast enough to deter renegotiation? Or will they rely on moral outrage while structural leverage erodes? There is an obstacle to defending coherence, and it is internal. Fragmentation, divergent national interests, fiscal asymmetries, political cycles misaligned with strategic timelines. Unity requires sacrifice before crisis, not after. But sacrifice is hard to sell when the threat feels abstract. Is Greenland abstract to a family watching prices rise? Bring it back to the street level. When defense priorities shift, public investment follows. Schools wait. Transport ages. Healthcare absorbs pressure. Citizens are told this is temporary, necessary, unavoidable. The language of inevitability replaces accountability. How many times can that explanation work? Globally, this moment is instructive. It shows that order is not self-sustaining. It requires constant reinforcement through action, not nostalgia. Guarantees are not historical artifacts. They are living commitments. The moral demand on leadership is clear. If stability is worth preserving, it must be defended with clarity, coordination, and honesty about costs. Citizens do not expect perfection. They expect seriousness. Because once governance becomes purely reactive, protection turns into improvisation. And improvisation is not a strategy. It is a gamble played with other people's lives. The citizen is the true measure of whether governance functions or merely performs. Policies, treaties, and strategic maneuvers are meaningless if the consequences land silently on households while decision-makers remain insulated. When Greenland becomes a headline, it is easy to dismiss it as distant or abstract, but the effects are immediate. Prices fluctuate, energy costs spike, job security shrinks, and social programs face cuts. These are not theoretical abstractions. They are lived realities. The question is no longer whether leaders understand strategy, but whether they consider the human cost of exercising it. Can a system claim legitimacy if its risks are exported downward while its benefits remain concentrated at the top? Transparency is more than disclosure. It is accountability in real time. Citizens deserve explanations that connect global maneuvers to local consequences. They deserve leaders capable of navigating markets with intellect, without becoming subordinate to their logic. Institutions should cushion volatility, not amplify it. Yet when structural leverage is treated as negotiable, ordinary people are left to absorb the shock. Every household becomes a proxy for risk management, and every worker a collateral participant in geopolitical chess. Is it acceptable that strategic foresight exists for the privileged, while the burden of instability is universal? Greenland is a mirror reflecting the fragility of perceived order. Ice may melt, routes may open, and investors may calculate advantage. But the lesson reaches far beyond geography. It illuminates a broader truth. The line between stability and speculation is narrowing. What was once assumed permanent, security, sovereignty, economic predictability, is now conditional. When governance treats these assumptions as negotiable, it signals that protection is not a right, but contingent service, dependent on leverage rather than law. Citizens feel the impact before they understand the cause. How many times will societies be asked to bear shocks without input, without explanation, without recourse? The moral imperative is stark. Governance exists to serve people, not to privilege the strategic advantage of a few. Every choice that externalizes risk onto the public erodes the social contract. Citizens are not resources to be allocated, buffers to be deployed, or variables to be absorbed. They are stakeholders entitled to foresight, consideration, and fairness. Will institutions rise to that responsibility, or will people be forced to adapt endlessly to power plays they never sanction but always pay for? That is a question Greenland exposes. not just for Europe or the Arctic, but for every system where governance, speculation, and human lives intersect. The answer will define the integrity of power in the years to come.